All right, this next speaker is a fan favorite. Of course, he's a historian, but he's much more than that. He's a researcher. He's a great thinker. He's inspired myself. I think he's inspired a lot of you when it comes to this field to think harder and I think more intelligently about this whole field and what is going on and the history of it. And I was very excited when he came to us with the title and the concept of this talk, which is Metamaterials and the Secret Science of UFOs. Help me give a warm welcome to Richard Dolan.
Thank you, Alejandro. Hi. Thank you, everyone. It's great to be here. I have a bad habit, which is before I speak, I'm usually at my table jabber-jawing like this for hours on end. So by 4 o'clock, I said to Tracy, I'm a little tired. She said, that's okay, we'll go get a little snack and you can go lie down. I went up to my room and I began snoring immediately. And at 5 o'clock, 15 minutes before starting, she said, hey, you better wake up. I was like, what? I just tanked up on coffee and here I am. That's my bad habit, but I'm very glad to be here. The thing is, when I'm at these events, this event particularly, it's like nonstop lecture mode. I don't know what it is. It's just, someone presses a button and I just go, and I haven't realized, oh wait, the lecture hasn't started yet. So here we are. I want to jump into this. They give 75 minutes, and I have a feeling I'm going to probably hit it right to the end. So this is not something that I usually will talk about. Normally, when I do a UFO lecture, I get into something like this, the politics of whether it's UFO secrecy, or I like to talk about interesting sightings, important sightings. It's definitely something that's, I think we all need to be aware of, that there's a long history of incredible, well-attested and documented UFO sightings. But I don't want to do that here. And nor am I really going to get into the politics of disclosure. If you see that image there, you've got Donald Kehoe in the top left, James McDonald down there, Stephen Greer and Stephen Bassett. Some of the, over the years, some of the prominent names associated with disclosure. Back in the 50s and 60s, no one was using that word, but Donald Kehoe, for sure, running NICAP for a long, long time, was the UFO and UFO secrecy man, and he was trying to get congressional hearings. You know, back in those days in particular, when people still really believed that they had a viable political Republican system, the idea was you work through Congress. It's funny, I know. It's really not funny, but it's actually what, but it made sense in that era. You would work through your elected representatives and seek them to have open congressional hearings on UFOs. Those are our representatives. They're of the people, and that's the proper way to do it. And Kehoe really worked very hard at that and never quite got what he was looking for. Did get some congressional interest, but not, I think, what he wanted. James McDonald, a great scientist from right around here, actually, a great atmospheric physicist who became very engaged publicly in the UFO subject, was a force, almost a force of nature, you could say, who had a lot to say about this publicly. And down at the bottom, Stephen Greer and Stephen Bassett in the 21st century, two people, again, talking about the necessity of U.S. government disclosure. I've talked a lot about disclosure. I wrote a book with the title Disclosure in it, and you know, we've had a 20-plus year open conversation in the UFO field about disclosure as basically a political act. You know, something in which the U.S. president presumably would get in front of everyone and say, it's real, they're here, here's the truth about what's going on. Politics. And I'm a firm believer in the importance of the political process for this. A lot of people say, why bother with what the politicians say? We know what the truth is. I would just say it does matter, because even though they're not really responsive to us, we need to make sure and have them act like they are responsive to us. That's how our system's supposed to be, and I'm not quite willing to give up on that. But there's other forms of disclosure. You know, over the last decade, I was thinking a lot about this. After I wrote After Disclosure in 2010, I never stopped thinking about it and started formulating different, in my mind, like different ways that disclosure would happen. I gave them different names. I called one fascist disclosure back in 2011, 2012. I've renamed it. I now call that controlled disclosure, and I think that's what we're seeing. So controlled disclosure is, I used to think about this way back before the internet changed, back when YouTube videos were not being censored and when social media wasn't being censored. But I thought, you know, there really might not be a government-initiated disclosure until and unless those people doing the disclosing are totally confident that they have complete control over the narrative that they're disclosing. Because disclosure is going to be really messy, and there's no motivation for anyone to do it unless they can control that spin. And I thought, well, how can that happen? And I figured, well, it can only happen once the internet is under enough control that alternate competing viewpoints are moved out to the fringe or eliminated, and the population's you know, out of it to the extent that they're not really paying attention. Jim Marrs always had a title of a book that he wanted to publish. He never published it, but he called it Zombie Nation. I mean, there's a great title for a book. He had the whole thing laid out. It just wasn't a book that he was able to get a publisher to give a title. But we're in the Zombie Nation era. I think we're getting there. And with enough control over the web, I don't think we're quite at the level of complete domination of the narrative, but even in the last 5 years, we've really moved a long way toward it. So a controlled form of disclosure is something that I think can happen and might be happening right now. So we all know about this story. This is the New York Times from almost 2 years ago now. Almost, let's see, December 2017, when they ran this article, and then one other article, of course, and then Politico the same day ran an article, all of them outing the AATIP program, of course, and the great Tic Tac UFO encounter that's probably now the single most famous UFO encounter of the 21st century, maybe ever. It actually might be the most famous UFO encounter now. It's gotten a lot of attention. I feel rightly so. I think it's an incredible, well attested. By the way, Kevin Day is here, and he's an amazing guy to talk to about this. But I'm mentioning this article here because this, I think, has signified a sea change in how our media is beginning to portray this phenomenon. And the big question we should be asking, and I will be asking as we go along, is why now? Why is this happening? Here's some of the folks at TTSA. I don't know any of them personally except one person there. I do know Dr. Hal Puthoff. I will be talking about him in a moment. I think what he has to say on Metamaterials is of key significance. A lot of people ask me all the time, what do you think TTSA is? Are they a CIA op? Are they legit? What are they trying to do? You know, there's a lot of ex-intelligence people in there, and it's not hard to look at them and think, a bunch of spooks running the disclosure outfit. And indeed, it's very interesting because when you do a YouTube search on UFO, just YouTube UFO, I mean, YouTube's so rigged now, it's a totally dishonest algorithm. I mean, it's absolutely, the only thing you get are major corporate, so you'll get CNN and BBC and Fox and more CNN and MSNBC and Fox and then CBS and NBC. It's like, that's all you get. That is all you get if you type in UFO for page after page of YouTube. So they rig, the only way these corporations win anything is by having the game rigged for them. That's what YouTube does. And TTSA benefits from that. So when you type in UFO on YouTube, you get a lot of pictures of Luis Elizondo and Christopher Mellon and mostly Elizondo and sometimes Tom DeLonge. Like, that's where all the big media is looking at. So it's easy to wonder, like, what is actually going on here? There's obviously an in with major media. And so I wonder, what is TTSA? Now, I actually, having said all of that, I'm not on board with calling them an op. I don't actually think that that's the case. This is my opinion. It's my opinion, not absolute fact. So you can critique it all you want. But what I look at them right now is as a faction. That's how I see them. So I think that within the system that we have right now, within this, basically it's an oligarchic type of governmental system where you've got powerful factions. And what you have really is not really government anymore. You've got really private, powerful corporations and entities working within special access programs, black budget programs. That's where the power is. And in that kind of a context, it seems to me that there's a lot of opportunities for people in industry, if they were to push their own, let's say, disclosure narrative, if they were able to get disclosure to move forward in any way, they could benefit from it. And maybe they believe it's a good thing too. Maybe some of them do. I personally think Hal Puthoff does. I have talked with him about this. I don't think he's lying to me. I think he's being truthful with me that he thinks it's a good idea. But I also think that if you are TTSA, excuse me, then you've got. People always have motivations. We're human beings, not angels. That's why we're human beings. We have motivations. We do things. So I'm sure that they have motivations for themselves. If you're a defense contractor and you know that this stuff is real, you know that there's exotic tech being hidden within the classified world that you don't have access to, but you want access to it, then you might have, and if you have connections in the system, you might want to push for a disclosure. Just saying. Like, I think one thing that we tend to miss out in our looking at the machinations of disclosure is private industry within the black budget world. I overlooked it for many years myself, so it's easy to do, I think, but I think that there's a lot of that going on here. It's my opinion at this time. So I'll talk a little bit about Dr. Hal Puthoff. I feel like I've been lucky. I've gotten to know him for almost 20 years. When my first book came out in 2000, and then it was republished in 2002, but even before the second edition of that book, of UFOs and the National Security State, he wrote to me, and he said, I really like your book. Bought a bunch of them, gave them out to my colleagues. I almost fell off my chair. And we actually had a number of conversations, and I flatter myself to think that we actually get along with each other and we like each other. I think we've had a couple of nice one-on-one conversations, and I'm grateful for that. But aside from a personal connection with him and the fact that I believe that he has integrity and I believe he's been honest with me over these many years, I don't think that that's clouding my judgment when I talk about this lecture that he gave just over a year ago. And he gave it in June of 2018 at the Society of Scientific Exploration / IRVA. Tracy earlier today was talking a little bit about IRVA. Did I do that? That was fun. Okay. Hopefully, bad Richard, don't do that again. I don't know how that. So, International Remote Viewing Association, SSE / IRVA. So it was June of 2018, and by the way, so this is a lecture that last time I checked is still available on Vimeo. I think it's $5. You got to drop $5 and you can watch this. It's worth it. When I told him that I saw his lecture on Vimeo, I think he was very surprised. I don't think he knew it was on the internet anywhere. But not only is it on the internet, it's gotten some commentary. One person who was there, I know who this gentleman was a good guy, very, very smart person, wrote a long, detailed description of Puthoff's lecture, and that was posted on Steve Bassett's PRG, Paradigm Research Group website. It's a really good analysis. So I'm going to talk a little. This is Hal Puthoff giving his lecture. That's a screenshot. And as you can see, there's called the DoD's UAP program, the backstory, the forward story. It's kind of an amazing thing because I've known for many years that he has had a deep interest in the UFO, UAP phenomenon, but this was not ever something that he was able to talk about publicly. And as he said in his lecture, I'll come back to that in a second, he said, I wasn't allowed to talk about it until now. If I had talked about it before this, I would have possibly gone to jail. So And also, I'll just say, in the aftermath of that, I wrote to him and I said, so did you get a green light? Like, what is this all about? How have you been able to do this? And he didn't really give me an answer. He gave me, I would say, a non-answer. And I said, I don't really think that's much of an answer. You're really not. And he said, well, maybe in the future. But somehow someone or some group gave a green light to him at this time so that he could do this. Now, definitely the impression that I got is that this was a very quiet conference that he was at. Not like this, not anything like this. Small and contained, and I think he knew it was going to be recorded, of course, but I don't think he knew it was going to go out on the web. So I think it was just going to be like old school DVDs type thing is what he was thinking, but that's not what happened at all. So the star of his presentation was this little piece of bismuth magnesium, the metamaterial, as we'll call it. I should point out, he didn't get into this in his lecture, but it really ought to be said. This was a material that was in the possession of Linda Moulton Howe for many, many years. So what happened was in the 1990s, this was sent into Art Bell of Coast to Coast, and it was allegedly or said to have been of a UFO crash retrieval. So it's from a UFO, it's an artifact. So Art Bell got it to Linda Moulton Howe, and she shopped it around to different scientists, including Hal Puthoff, whose laboratory at Earth Tech looked at this apparently in quite a lot of detail. And so he's reporting on this material. So what he did in this lecture, he words everything very carefully. It's very exact, right? And he's making it very obvious throughout that this artifact is not anything that we know how to make. And that's like point number one. So after all of the analysis, he said, at first we didn't even know what this thing could possibly be for years, let alone who could have made it. We don't know how you could have gotten the tiny layers of bismuth and magnesium, much less than the length of a human hair, each layer, to bond in the way that they bonded. He said, we don't know how to do that. He did not say, oh yeah, it's aliens. He didn't do that. But he also, it wasn't difficult to read between the lines of what he was trying to say here, that this doesn't seem to be anything that we know how to have made. And then he talked pretty candidly about, and this is all kind of vague, but the strategy by him, by his people, by his group, by whoever was allowing him to talk, the strategy to advance the disclosure process, he said, without breaking non-disclosure agreements or releasing classified information. So just stop and think about that for a minute. So if you're in his position, or in the position of someone comparable to him, and you've had access to classified, highly sensitive classified information on UAP or UFOs for many years, and now somehow you've got a green light to talk about it, how do you do it? It's not like someone says, well, you're now allowed to say everything. I don't think I've come to understand, I should say, that I don't think it works like that, because there's probably within one piece of data about this material, there might be 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 specific classified regulations that govern the things that you can say. And if you've got all of these different agreements in place, they don't necessarily all go away just because you have a partial green light to talk a little bit about this thing. So what he's saying is he's and his colleagues have been working on a strategy to move disclosure forward without breaking the law, basically. So it's a tricky, a very, very careful path that they have to walk through. So he didn't say this, but it's easy to wonder that he was given a green light on condition that no classified information, nothing classified is released with the things that you say. So it would be maybe a yellow light, proceed with caution. As Bassett put it on his PRG website, according to Puthoff, we're not saying it's extraterrestrial, but it's extraterrestrial. And I think that's a fair way to put this lecture. Absolutely. And having spoken with this man many times and not going to, give up things that he has said to me personally in confidence, I will just still say that I think that is an exactly accurate characterization of how Hal Puthoff thinks about this. That's what I believe. I strongly believe that. So this lecture is one little truth bomb after another, or one bombshell after another. One of the, and here I kind of just repeated this, but let me just say, so he talks about his long-standing interest and his long-standing knowledge of the UFO phenomenon, which he doesn't, I think he does say UFO at one or another point, but he basically says UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena. And this is also one of the, very obvious rebrandings that we see taking place at the UFO field with the TTSA people and with Hal Puthoff, to the extent that they're going public. They haven't dropped the phrase UFO altogether, but there's definitely an emphasis of calling this UAP. I think it's kind of a smart move, thinking about it. If you've got a completely inert media that doesn't really care about this, scientific establishment that's totally hostile to this, and if you're congressional representatives that are afraid to touch this publicly, then you need to do a kind of rebranding, it seems to me, and I can see why they're moving from UFO to UAP. The danger that I've always believed that comes with that is by changing the acronym and by just talking about these vague UAP as if we don't know what they are, which is what you hear all the time from these guys. We don't know what they are. You're siphoning out all the history of the UFO phenomenon. You're siphoning out 70, 80 years of known military interactions with these things. It's as if the 1940s and 50s and 60s never happened. When you watch shows like Unidentified or hear Elizondo talk on the news or hear in Hal Puthoff's speech as well. And I think that's by design. I don't think they're trying to deceive. I think what they're trying to do is limit the conversation so that they're able to move it forward for their purposes. This is my take on it. But he's talking about his longstanding interest in UFOs, and he says, I didn't publish anything on this because, quote, the program I was involved in, and he's talking about AATIP here, probably others, but definitely AATIP. The program I was involved in the Pentagon and in the intelligence community has been top secret. And he said, only recently has there been release of information about the program, so this is the first chance that I've had a chance to actually appear before the public and speak about the details of the program and not go to jail. This is a really fun quote here. I'm going to read this. He says, the Defense Intelligence Agency was concerned about the fact that obvious observation had shown that advanced aerospace vehicles, that's another acronym to keep in mind, AAV, advanced aerospace vehicles, crafts or drones of unknown origin, were flying all over the United States, over waters, in fact, globally, as was the case. I love that. Like, oh, really? It's a global phenomenon. Do tell. Like, as if no one knew this. He just says it so casually. Yes, we discovered that these unknown objects were actually, maybe they're drones or crafts of unknown origin, but turns out they've been seen all over the country. And in fact, they've been seen all over the world. But again, he does this in this classic, very low-key way. And it's actually, I think, a really, really clever, smart way to do this. It's almost as if you don't notice that this, yes, we've noticed this is a global phenomenon. Like, of course we've noticed a global phenomenon. But it's a total repositioning of the UFOs. And then he says this, we don't know where they come from, who's driving them, what the intent is, possibly off-world even. Very coy language. And this is another statement which I think you really see this a lot being hit on the show Unidentified. He says, and what if potential adversaries make breakthroughs by studying this phenomena or via crashed retrieved materials? And again, just to take a few steps back and see some perspective on this lecture, this is a man now, he's in his 80s. He's had roughly 50 or so years in top secret, compartmented intelligence information. Along with Dr. Kit Green, another man I just interviewed recently and wrote an article about him. Those two, it's possible. If they don't have the longest consecutive top secret clearance, then they're certainly right up there. So, for him to be saying this as he's saying at this lecture, as quietly as he is, I think is very, very significant. And this, what if potential adversaries bit? These were questions, of course, that were being asked by guys like Donald Kehoe back in the 1950s and 60s. In other words, talking about the national security implications of UFOs as a global phenomenon. And back then, they were saying, well, heck, what if the Russians mistake a UFO for one of our missiles and they think we're firing at them and it starts World War III? We've got to have open public hearings on this because, the military is just blowing this whole thing off. That was Kehoe's opinion. These types of questions have been going on a long time, but again, with Hal Puthoff, he's raising it in a very, as if we're thinking of this for the first time. We don't know who they are, where they come from. Well, possibly off-world. I would hazard to guess, just looking at the history of this for 70 years and more of the United States government interaction with this, there is a department somewhere that knows full well what they're dealing with here. They're not scratching their heads thinking, I wonder if this is from off-world. I think that there are individuals who've got a much more clear idea about this. But there's reasons for him to do this. So they're pushing this, like this is saying a lot, even though this is not an official government statement. This is a very important statement nonetheless. And this is Harry Reid of Nevada, of course, who's retired, who was the sponsor of the AATIP program. And, a lot of people make a big thing out of Reid and Bigelow and the sweetheart deal. If $22 million constitutes a sweetheart deal, then I've lost all sense of proportion with Washington politics. It's not a lot of money. Frankly, it would seem to me, and I'm as someone who's never even met Robert Bigelow, so what do I know? But I would think that he's actually a very good candidate to run this type of program, particularly when you hear the rumors that most of the AATIP program that we know of, the $22 million, went into looking at the Skinwalker Ranch. So that's the big rumor. I think it's more than a rumor. So Bigelow would make a lot of sense. There hasn't been much that's come out about that, but it certainly seems to be that's the case. Anyway, here's Harry Reid. He's basically following the same line that Hal. I'm going to get back to Hal Puthoff's speech in a moment. But Harry Reid saying, well, we don't know the answers, but we have plenty of evidence to support the questions. This is about science and national security. If America doesn't take the lead in answering these questions, others will. It's a brave statement, really, when you think about it. Can you imagine this type of thing being said even 5 years ago by an American senator or some other high-level official? This type of talk was absent from American politics. I was chatting about this on a number of occasions with Grant Cameron, another, obviously many of you know Grant, he's a great researcher, and both of us were just commenting on how shocked. Like, if 5 years ago we were to be fast-forwarded to now and see the information that's been coming out, I think both of us would have been absolutely shocked. I would not have expected this level of candidness. It's not 100% open and candid, but it's vastly more than anything that I would have predicted 5 years ago. Hal Puthoff is talking also about the Russians. He's making the case, Really what he's doing here is quietly making the case that we need to open up public conversation on UAP and UFO. And one of the things he's saying is, look, the Russians are into this. He talks about the Thread 3 program, which was from the early 1990s. And he's saying, we dug up this document out of the Soviet Union. Actually goes from, I think, Thread 3 is from 1990 to 1995, so it spans the end of the Soviet Union and into the Russian Federation. But he's saying it shows the Soviet Union had a massive program also trying to get to the root of all of this, these UAPs. In this document, a number of research institutes and military institutes are listed. And it's just a little bit about Thread 3. That's Yuri Gagarin there, by the way. This does look like it's a significant Russian study of UFOs for about 5 years. One section talked about UFO sightings by cosmonauts, including Yuri Gagarin, first man in space. I didn't know this until I researched this in Thread 3, but he said he saw a UFO himself in orbit and would be willing to discuss it if he was given permission, and that apparently is in this document. Thread 3, this Russian document, also discusses American space encounters with reference to things seen on the moon by U.S. astronauts and the NASA cover-up. So, and then Hal Puthoff talks about Bigelow Advanced Aerospace Systems, BASS. This is an image of Robert Bigelow there. This was reported just 1 month before Hal Puthoff's speech. George Knapp, who is here this weekend, is the man who broke this story. This is a very important story, and when this document came out, I remembered reading a lot of skeptics pouncing on it, saying things like, well, that's not written in a proper military format. Well, no, it wasn't written in that manner. It was written by Bigelow's company, but they were doing an assessment of these advanced aerospace vehicles, these AAVs, and the assessment, and I'm sure Hal Puthoff was involved in formulating this actually, they say it is no known air vehicle in the inventory of the United States or foreign nation as far as we can tell. So all of this came out of the formal AATIP study that was funded by U.S. taxpayers, discussing low observable characteristics, that is, they're stealthy. They exhibit advanced aerodynamic performance that we can't comprehend, instant acceleration, stopping on a dime, you know. Kevin Day talked about this when he was aboard the USS Princeton, observing through radar an object, Tic Tac UFO. I think he said it was at 28,000 feet. It descends in 0.78 seconds to sea level and stops. So that's well over 20,000 miles per hour. Things like that. So the BASS analysis talks about this, and Puthoff's talking about that. Infrared tapes from the pilots do not show any kind of hot propulsion gases. Yeah, so right, infrared is like, where's the heat coming from? How do these things move? And the BASS analysts didn't have an answer for that. And then the last point here is that these objects, these AAVs, these UFOs, had the advanced capability to remain stationary and then take off like a shot. So Hal's talking about all of this stuff. And then he talks about the 38 DIA papers. As a result of this lecture, Stephen Aftergood of the American Federation of Science put out a FOIA request to get these titles, and he did get it. That was a few months later. I'll talk about that in a minute. But so here at this lecture, Hal Puthoff is talking about these papers. And this is actually an interesting story. As he put it, Robert Bigelow wanted him to work for this AATIP program, and Puthoff's thinking, okay, great, so maybe one thing I can do that could be useful is for me to canvass the scientific community to get a sense from leading experts in relevant fields as to what their science will look like in the year 2050. So I could request speculative papers on future tech and future science from certain areas. And this is what he actually did. One thing he did not tell them was that this was for a Pentagon-funded UFO program. That was the one thing he didn't tell them. But everything else was pretty straightforward. He says, look, I would like for you to do this. And he got 38 papers. And as he put it, he called it a general survey of aerospace futures. He said, I decided this would be the best way to get the best knowledge we had across many technologies without actually exposing what we wanted to know. So again, he had to be crafty. He had to be very exact, and he was. Here's some of the. Do I have another page on this? Yeah. So this is some of the key themes. So positron, aerospace, propulsion. A lot of these I wouldn't even know what they often mean. Warp drive, we all know what that means. Space-time metric engineering. That's one that he actually wrote, and that's the only paper here that I've actually read in total. The titles are available, and in theory, the papers are available, but in practice, they're not readily available. You have to write to the authors of these papers, and you can probably get a lot of them. Space-time metric engineering, though, like, what is that? That's about engineering space-time for space travel, essentially. Dark energy, extra dimensions, negative mass propulsion, traversable wormholes, and stargates is one theme, one paper. Anti-gravity for aerospace applications, invisibility, cloaking, programmable matter. At the bottom, I have the phrase Joint Worldwide Intelligence Communication Systems, JWICS. That's the server where these papers are stored. There's 38 of them, and you can just see them here. And these are, searchable. That's all of them. The JWICS server is a Defense Department server, I think connected with the Joint Chiefs and the DIA. And I actually got this directly from Hal Puthoff. He said, I have learned that those 38 papers are considered the future tech Bible on the JWICS server. And he said they are the most searched, most popular papers of their kind on that whole server. So if you can't get a chance to read the papers, at least you can rest assured that people in the classified world are jumping over each other to read these papers. When Stephen Aftergood of the American Federation of Sciences did his FOIA request to get these papers, that was in January of 2019, of this year. His statements and a lot of the news coverage was really dismissive of these. Like Harry Potter technology, Pentagon wasting your money on fantasy tech. And they could not have been more wrong. It's very obvious that these people they're not really understanding the significance of what all of this is, actually. And I just interpret it as a classic case of scientific heads stuck in sand like an ostrich. So let me talk about this. This is going back to Hal Puthoff's discussion of this little interesting artifact, whatever this thing is. So he stated this as well. He said this is sent to Art Bell. No, there's no provenance of this. And he wondered, is this a hoax? I don't know if it's a hoax. He's very careful about this. And even now, his official position is, we don't really know what this is. Like, I've noticed their language is super careful about it. But let me just continue with this description. So he describes it as multi-layered, primarily bismuth and magnesium. He even made the statement, it looks like it's been in a crash. It looks a little messed up. The white, the lighter colors are bismuth. They are less than a human hair. The magnesium is a little thicker than a human hair, maybe 10 times the size of a human hair. These were taken to, I guess, a variety of national laboratories, metallurgists. No one knows how or who manufactured this. And no one's been able to reproduce it, and it had no obvious function. What is this for? So it's a mysterious artifact, turns up, alleged crash retrieval from the 40s. But aside from all that, it's a baffling piece of an artifact. And what he was saying is, well, years go by and our science begins to catch up. So he described this as a metamaterial. I'll get into that in just a moment. But here's an interesting quote he gives. He said, the precise combination of these materials at exactly the dimensions that we find them in are, quote, an excellent microscopic waveguide for very high frequency electromagnetic radiation terahertz frequencies. I'm not a scientist. I had to figure that one. I had to look that up and get into all of that. But what he is saying, as far as I'm able to understand, is that a waveguide, think of a canal as a guide of water, right? It's guide the waves of water. So this is a waveguide. This material is a waveguide for high-frequency electromagnetic radiation in the terahertz frequencies. So it's very high, so a certain frequency, and it takes those frequencies and guides them in such a way. So just hold on to that for a moment. The wavelength at which it really functions well is 60 microns, which apparently that's very small indeed. What he's saying is that this material seems to be effective for some kind of anti-gravitic effect. So that's the key, that it somehow negates gravity. I'm going to get more into that. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit to the Tic Tac UFO, and I'm going to talk about a statement, follow-up statement by Dr. Jack Sarfati, who is another interesting guy. I've never talked directly with Sarfati, but I do know for many years he didn't seem to like me. I don't think he liked my politics. I was in the early post-9/11 era. I had a lot of mouthy things to say about that event, and it got back to Sarfati, and I learned he didn't like what I had to say, and he thought Dolan was a real pain in the PITA, pain in the ass. But aside from that, I think his physics are quite interesting as far as I'm able to understand it in my limited way. So this is from a video where Sarfati is being interviewed at the very end of December 2018. He's talking about the physics of the Tic Tac UFO, and this is roughly speaking a to-scale design of the Tic Tac UFO that David Fravor and other pilots saw off the coast of California in 2004. So there's Jack Sarfati. I think he's a pretty cool guy, actually. I'd love to meet him. So he gave an interview at the end of 2018. It's on YouTube. And he says a few things that are really interesting that Puthoff did not really go into in his lecture in as much detail. So he's saying, look, when you look at these types of UFO encounters, like the Tic Tac UFO, as Fravor always described it, he says, I saw it, I circled around, it came up from the water, it's circling around opposite to me, it came up to meet me and then shot off faster than a bullet. It was gone out of visibility within 2 seconds, perfect visibility of 10 miles, and a practical visibility of 50 miles. You do the math, you're talking it's 9,000 miles per hour or more, it's just gone. So that type of acceleration, Sarfati is saying, under any normal physics that we understand conventionally, you'd need a tremendous amount of energy, obviously, for this thing to do this. But he says, for any of these encounters, these UFO encounters, there's clearly no jet engines being used. So what are we talking about? He says there's no apparent thrust involved. And he tries to explain this, and I think he does. He says there's actually, turns out you don't need all that much energy. He talked about metric engineering, and this was Puthoff's paper, and he points out space-time is a metric field. So engineering space-time, what does that even mean? Engineering space, engineering time? We have physics that talk about this now. That's pretty interesting to me. Back in the 1990s, there was a mathematician out of the University of Wales named Miguel Alcubierre. He's quite famous in this field. He developed, you could say, the math of warp drive. So in that sense, and apparently his math is sound, and according to this theory, you could if you have enough energy, right, around your spaceship, like the USS Enterprise, you could shrink space in front of you and stretch it behind you, and meanwhile you're in this little space-time bubble. And by doing that, it's like it's a loophole around the speed of light limitation. You know, within normal space-time, it seems to be impossible to surpass the speed of light. But if you're in a space-time bubble and you're warping, warp factor 2, warp factor 3, if you're warping space, then you actually can exceed the speed of light, practically speaking, even though within your space-time bubble, you're not exceeding it. So all of that seems to be sound, and Alcubierre did this math 25 plus years ago. But the objection to it has always been, yeah, that's great, but we don't know how to, the amount of energy you need to generate that warping is beyond anything we can conceive of. So there's that practical problem of generating the energy for warp drive. But what Sarfati is hinting at in this very interesting interview is not so fast with that assumption. There's ways of creating this warp field without all that energy necessary. So let me talk about these metamaterials. What is a metamaterial? You could look this up. There's even a Wikipedia explanation of metamaterials, and there's other scientific pages that talk about metamaterials. This is definitely a burgeoning science. It's growing. So a metamaterial, I guess the best definition or simple one would be an artificial material constructed as a lattice at a microscopic level. So it's a very complex, microscopically constructed, manufactured material. So when you're creating this type of lattice structure, you know, if you've got an engineering bent of mind, let your imagination go here. You could probably create all kinds of really interesting properties with metamaterials in terms of not just tensile strength, but conductivity of various types and a lot of other properties probably that many of us aren't even thinking of. If you can get into that level of detail with your manufacturing capability, which only very recently have we been able to consider getting down into some of these very, very small levels. These are some images and designs and conceptions of different types of metamaterial designs, so you can see that. So what Sarfati is saying, and this is an image that came right out of the YouTube video that describes it. So he's referring, Sarfati is referring to Puthoff and Eric Davis's lab. Eric Davis, also very much in the news these days in the UFO field, has worked with Hal Puthoff for many, many years at Earth Tech. They're really very close colleagues, and so Sarfati's talking about their research, and he's obviously very deeply familiar with it. So he's saying what you do, the physics of how these things may work is you have pumped layer metamaterials. Not sure exactly what that meant, to be perfectly honest with you, but that's the phrase he uses. At the nanometer and angstrom level. That's really, really small, and in fact, as far as I'm able to determine, we do not yet have a capability in terms of our manufacturing to do metamaterials at that small a level. I'll show you a paper in a moment that is my evidence for that. But he says if you get these materials manufactured at such a small level, the craft can then soften, as he says, the space-time fabric in a thin boundary layer around itself. So if you got the craft and the skin of the craft is this metamaterial, and as Puthoff said, if you get a certain high-level terahertz range electromagnetic radiation, it has an anti-gravity effect. So Sarfati says, yes, it is. It's essentially, you get it because it softens space-time around. In other words, you're starting to create a bubble, a space-time bubble around you. Soften is just the word that he likes to use to describe this. And this is Sarfati. He's talking about Eric Davis's research on this. He says, Davis observed in an electron microscope of this metamaterial, this artifact, he said that it had a metamaterial lattice structure at the nanometer level and the angstrom level. So Puthoff didn't say this in his lecture, but Sarfati is saying it about Davis's research. So it's clearly the same, or I'm going to assume it's the same piece. Maybe it's a different piece, actually. But I'm working on the assumption right now that it's the same piece. The point is, the metamaterial lattice is detectable at the angstrom level. So that's 1/10 of a nanometer. Now, how small is that? This is a paper that was published this year by the European Commission. And this is a request. They're looking for research on something what they call beyond metamaterials, designing novel optical materials from angstrom scale interactions. And I highlighted an area in blue there, and I'll just read it to you. This is, however, practical fabrication limitations do not allow good precision beyond tens of nanometers. Neither do they yield high-quality material properties. So you have European Commission, at least this is one example of an organization that's trying to get state-of-the-art nano-level metamaterials being made and stating right now, as of 2019, we are not in the position where we can get precision beyond the tens of nanometers. But if you remember what I just said about what Eric Davis apparently observed in an electron microscope, the metamaterial that he was looking at had a metamaterial lattice that was at the nanometer level and the angstrom level. So if it's true that the best we can do is in the tens of nanometers, this thing is at least 100 times smaller in its construction, or at least 10 times smaller and possibly 100 times smaller in its construction, and with good properties as well. You know, what they're saying in this European Commission paper is we can't really get precise beyond the tens of nanometers, and we're not getting high quality material properties either. So that's apparently the official limit that we have right now. So I just think that's interesting. And however old that metamaterial artifact is, you know, it was alleged from the 1940s, but at the very least, we've had it since the 1990s. So it's a long time, over 25 years we've had it, and apparently it has these properties of an incredibly advanced caliber. And you just have to ask yourself, who's making this? How was it made? I'm really thinking of only two possibilities: either a truly off the grid, secret, covert, incredibly advanced scientific group, black budget, that's well ahead of us, and that's always a possibility, or someone not from this civilization, something beyond. So, and I'm still talking about Sarfati here. So he's you know, talking about Davis's electron microscope results, the lattice structure manufactured at an incredibly small scale. He says when you get that small, you develop strange properties. And he talks about negative indices of refraction. What is that? So he's using very advanced scientific physics speak here. He says when an electromagnetic field interacts with it, a, quote, negative energy density results. Negative energy density. And this is what causes anti-gravity. And I'll just point out one of the titles of the papers, and this is one by Dr. Eric Davis, one of the 38 papers that Hal Puthoff was talking about, is titled Traversable Wormholes, Stargates, and Negative Energy by Dr. Eric Davis. So I think that there's a connection here. The thing that Sarfati says about when you get into this level of detail, this small, infinitesimally small manufacture of these metamaterials, what it does is it slows down the speed of light. I had to look this up and to ask, like, is it actually possible to slow down the speed of light? And yes, it actually can happen and does happen. So what he was saying here is that this material appears to do that, or he believes that it does that, I guess I should say. And that is, you know, when I was talking earlier about Miguel Alcubierre's equation of, you know, creating warp warping of space, you need a lot of energy. But you don't need a lot of energy if you're changing the math equations, and particularly you're changing the speed of light. And this is one trick, as Sarfati puts it. You reduce the speed of light inside the metamaterial. And indeed, there's, you can search this out. There's articles that talk about this. And so what he says is that this metamaterial slows down the speed of light significantly, not a little bit, but quite a lot. And he said if you can reduce the speed of light enough, then the surrounding space-time becomes less stiff and you're softening the boundary. And he says, this is an exact quote, he says, which means we can actually warp space-time by a very large amount with a very small amount of energy. Maybe even a AAA battery can do it. That's the trick. I don't know if he was being facetious here or not, but I think his point was this is not an outrageous proposition anymore. And as I was exploring these ideas when they were coming out at the time, it really made me think of UFO propulsion in new ways. Because I think that most of us, for many, many years, when you think about how these objects might move, we're thinking, okay, what can replace a really good jet engine and that type of thing? And what other kinds of engines are there? But I have to say, I had not considered, at least in a sophisticated scientific way, how the skin of the craft itself could be absolutely critically important in this whole process. And it seems to me that that's the direction that what Puthoff is saying and what Davis appears to be studying and what Sarfati is saying, that seems to be the direction that they're moving with this. This is one of a million different graphic representations of warping of space-time. And, normally where we think of that as an effect of a lot of gravity. And we know that bodies in space, large bodies in space, do warp space and time. Time is not the same at the surface of a large body as it is when you go higher and farther away from that body. That's a measurable effect. So normally large, heavy bodies will affect space-time, but again, what Sarfati is saying that where we might be able to do it without a lot of energy by constructing the right type of very, very small angstrom level metamaterial in the right way. And this is just another representation of warping space and time. So there you go. So this is actually one of the fastest times I've done a lecture. I actually might be able to do a couple of Q&A, or I can, maybe I'll talk when I'm done with this a little bit about a document that I have been talking about all year, which is authored by Eric Davis, and it's, I call it the Wilson document. I think I will talk about that for the next 15 minutes. But I just want to wrap this part up here. And, I was opening this talk with you about, historically, when we talk about UFO disclosure, we think of it as a political process. And I think that's important. We want to keep the politics moving forward, and we do not, in my view, want to give up on maintaining a sense of ownership over this republic of ours, this society. So we need to have politics responsive to us. But I think what's happening is that a different kind of disclosure is happening. And it's not getting enough appreciation yet from the broader public. This could take many more years as far as I know, but I personally think that the scientific statements that these gentlemen have been making is very important. What it requires, clearly, is a lot of follow-up from other scientists, replication of the results, and so forth. In theory, that should be possible, and I would like to see them moving ahead on that, publishing their results first, formally publishing them, not just talking about them, publishing them, and then moving forward with getting other laboratories to do the same work on this artifact. I think that can happen. I don't see why it can't happen. And if it does, I could see that as a very significant development. Now, knowing our society as it is, it's entirely possible that we might move ahead with the discussion of these interesting scientific properties without really getting into the implications of how we got this stuff. And it's possible that this would not lead to a genuine UFO disclosure. But I think it's important nevertheless. So I think this is pretty much everything I wanted to say on this. I just consider this very important, and I wanted to share this with you. And you might be thinking, well, who am I really to talk about their research? I'm not qualified in their science at all. But the one thing that I have is a curious mind, and I just wanted to figure this out for myself. And once I started talking about it with a few colleagues, I noticed that they were interested in how I was presenting this and how I was raising these issues. And I thought, well, I don't know anyone else who's actually getting into the scientific implications of that lecture and of these discussions. So I thought, let's do it. Let's get the talk going here, because this is definitely something very important. I'll switch gears a little bit. And I don't have any visuals here to give you, but since I've got you all here, and since I think this is important, I'm going to just go and talk about the Wilson document and my own involvement of it. So a lot of you know about this by now, I'm guessing, but some of you may not. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a backstory. Back in 2006, I was in the presence of someone who showed me two sheets of paper. Turned out that they were 2 of the 15 pages of what is now known as the Wilson document. But I was shown these in late 2006, and it was in the form of notes that were typed out, and it was like an interview that had been taking place between 2 people. I didn't know who these people were. But it was explained to me that this had all taken place, that one individual had interviewed another individual, and that this individual had been a high-level person in the Joint Chiefs of Staff who had attempted and failed to gain access to an ET tech reverse engineering program. That he learned about it, and that he tried looking into it and knocked on a bunch of doors and finally found the program and was denied access. And I was shown 2 pages of these notes, and the individual was very upset that he wasn't able to get access to this, and he said, yes, I learned that this was technology not of this earth, not made by man, not by human hands. And when I read that, that had a definite impact on me back in 2006. And I actually talked about this on a number of occasions at various conferences and in radio interviews too. But I have never outed the person who showed me the pages, because that was in confidence. But I knew that this existed. Turns out, by the way, since the whole thing leaked out last June, a lot of other people have written to me, some very big names who they don't want their name out there, but they're very well-known people. They said, oh yeah, I saw that document, and we traded notes. Who showed you? Who showed you? But anyway, the point is that this leaked out, and the way that it leaked out is that astronaut Edgar Mitchell died in early 2017, and he was part of this whole circle of people. Basically, I call it the NIDS circle, the National Institute of Discovery Science people. So that's really what this was. So you have people like Hal Puthoff and Dr. Kit Green and Dr. Eric Davis and Dr. Colm Kelleher, and Dr. Edgar Mitchell, and Robert Bigelow, and others, And what would happen in the 90s and in the early 2000s is it's very obvious that they all have their own different levels of security clearances. They all talk to each other. They're all trying to figure out the important things that they want to figure out. They share information with each other, presumably to the extent that they can, and this is what they would do. And Mitchell died, and I've learned from one very good gentleman who his name is out there, and I talked about him, but that when Mitchell died, some of his key papers were not necessarily going to survive. And they were legally and openly and allowed to be removed to preserve them for posterity. So that's about as much as I feel that I'm at liberty to say about this. And there's a lot that I don't know anyway, frankly. And so for a year or more, these papers, and this I don't know, is how many people had access to them and how many people JPEG'd them and all of that, I don't know. But they were subject of some very quiet hand-wringing, like, what do we do with this? It's really an important thing because there's apparently some sensitive information and some very sensitive conversations. But the story did come out, and Grant Cameron was approached by this one gentleman at a conference about a year ago, almost a year ago, and was shown the full 15 pages of the notes by Eric Davis of his meeting with Admiral Thomas R. Wilson. And that's what I had been shown in a very small form in '06. And the story is this. So Wilson in '97, a meeting had been arranged with him. He was deputy head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff in 1997. And Stephen Greer, who was very active at that time in trying to get congressional meetings on UFOs and talking to government people, whoever would listen to him, and accompanied by Dr. Edgar Mitchell and a couple of other people, was able to get a meeting with Admiral Wilson at the Joint Chiefs in April of '97, and this did happen. It's an amazing thing, really. Stephen Greer does a presentation of some sort, talks about Philip Corso's new book, which was brand new, and other things, and meeting ends, and apparently Wilson was very interested and said, I'm going to look further into this, because Greer, who had always been saying there are these deep, rogue special access programs that manage this project, that manage ET Tech. And so 5 years later, Eric Davis gets a meeting with Wilson, and he gets Wilson to talk about this, and Wilson and Davis takes very copious notes. And Wilson is saying, yes, I did. And in fact, within a couple of months, I found the program. It was buried within a program, very, very squirreled away. He said, I got help finding it from the recent Secretary of Defense, William Perry, who had done a reorganization of the special access programs and actually helped me to be able to find this. I did find it. And I was perplexed at how secret it was, and I found the program manager. I talked to the program manager, then I talked to the program manager and the security officer and the corporate attorney on a conference call, and I said, I am authorized to have oversight of your program, and it is your oversight that you didn't bring me in. And they said, well, we'll get back to you. I was like, actually, what happened? And then they arranged a meeting. He flies out somewhere out west, and he meets with them in a secure facility. And according to what he tells Davis, who wrote very copious notes, they acknowledged to him that, yes, we're in a program to reverse engineer technology that doesn't appear to be from this earth, not made by human hands. And painfully slow progress, they'd said. And they'd said a lot of other things. This is a document that you can easily search out now. I have it on my website. You can freely read it on Richard Dolan members. But anyway, they tell him a few of these things, and he's very indignant because he wants to be in the program. And they said, nope, you're not in, sorry. And he says, I'm going to complain. They said, fine, go complain. He does complain to his higher-ups, and he's threatened with his career and his promotion. Said, look, this will not go well for you if you want to fight this. You won't get promoted to head of Defense Intelligence Agency, and you'll take an early retirement and lose a couple of stars along the way. Do you really want that? And he sucked it up. He didn't like it, but he played ball, ran DIA for a couple of years, retired in 2002, and went off into private industry, where, according to a conversation I just recently had with Dr. Kit Green, he said, once you leave government and you go off into private industry, your clearances become more and better and deeper and much more meaningful. I said, why? He said, because that's where all the action is, that's where all the money is, that's where all the brain power is, that's where everything is done. So the way the system works, and this is, and by the way, one thing I asked Kit Green, he was loath to authenticate the document officially. All of his friends are in that document. He didn't want to out them. It's a very delicate situation for them. I understand that. So he gave me this very, very ultra exact non-statement statement about that. But then we talked off the record for probably close to a half hour. I said, hey, by the way, can I tell people that you gave me an off-the-record statement on this as well? He said, sure. So he gave me a very long off-the-record statement about this. One thing he said on the record, he said every bit of detail in that 15 pages was exactly, he said, how did he put it? He said the scheme of everything in there was exactly right. He's trying delicately to say this, you know. It was all authentic. He said, you know, someone like in Wilson's position would think that they would have authority to supervise these programs, but they don't. He said, no, those people, they don't have the authority. The whole point now of the U.S. government running its black budget programs is to basically serve as security for these massive corporations that take your tax dollars and my tax dollars and use them to study super advanced tech, possibly off-world tech, and make their own innovations and patents off of them. That's how the system operates. And, you know, in a couple of instances, the Pentagon or the DoD might get access to some of that technology, but the impression very strong impression, actually, of the guy from Dr. Green was, no, most of it stays in private industry, and the Pentagon doesn't really get a lot of it. So that's what these SAPs, these special access programs, are about more and more. It's deeply, deeply privatized power, but with the U.S. military and national security establishment providing infrastructure support and providing security over this to protect these private corporations. And then, of course, when the DoD people guarding them retire, they get hired by these corporations, and they get a lot of money, and they get in with the in crowd. I'll take a wild guess that Thomas Wilson's clearances went way, way up when he left the DIA and went off into private industry, aerospace, a company that was just bought out by Boeing, I believe, just the last couple of years. So that's the system. So the whole, this leak of this document, I don't know how many more there are actually going to come out, and it's possible that none may come out. I don't have any information about how that whole process is working and where these documents are. I have to think that there are some good ones that remain to be uncovered. And the only thing I can tell you is that from my very limited vantage point, I will definitely try to persuade any relevant parties to release everything that can be released, but I don't know how much leverage I really have, but I certainly would try. I think personally that these papers of Dr. Mitchell are very important potentially. I don't know if they're explosive in the sense of government, official government documents or anything like that, but it's certainly very interesting to me to know that you've got some very high level, very well plugged in people having the kinds of conversations that they were obviously having. It's a real interesting disconnect when you get the official word for year after year after year that, nothing to UFOs, a lot of misunderstanding, misinterpretation. And then you find these exceptionally intelligent and briefed individuals having conversations of a completely different tenor. So I think that's all very interesting. I feel I should get ready to wrap this up. I think I'm just about ready to, I think I'm hitting the end time here. I think that we're in a very interesting time in our history. Well, we can all see that, can't we? This is, there's nothing like this. And I think it's really easy for us to lose sight of just how bizarre our time period is. When I'm not reading about UFOs, I like to read old history books late at night on my Kindle. And I just do, you know. It's like, it's not always UFOs. And so I'll read about the fall of Rome or medieval history, or I just finished a history of the 17th century diplomacy. That whole, like, who cares about that? I find it fascinating. The reason I'm mentioning it here is it helps me keep some perspective on the craziness of our era. Like, we're in a time that is so radically different than any other moment in human history, and it's like it's a continual revolution that's happening now that's so fast, and it's very disconcerting for a lot of us. It is for me. And so with that in mind, so we're in a point where, you know, we talk about artificial intelligence. We're on the cusp of some very, very strong AI. And the big argument is, well, will the computers be smarter than us or not? And will they have consciousness like we do? And to me, those are actually secondary questions to the fact that AI will become smart enough probably to replace a lot of our jobs, and smart enough to seem like it's conscious, even if it isn't really. And it'll be smart enough to be able to run our society in ways that we don't really get to run it. So that's a transformation right there. And then you've got other transformations. You've got the transhumanist transformation. The fact that we've now mastered the human genome, and we're, you know, people, you got these mad scientists really trying to stop the aging process, and to create super babies and smart babies, and then you've got these other crazy scientists who want to put a little chip in your brain so that you can connect to the cloud. Like, Alexa's not good enough now. You've got to have a direct line to the cloud. And you ask yourself, and these people, they scare me to no end. They're like, well, you'll be smarter. And Ray Kurzweil says, you'll be sexier. I don't think that's sexy, and I don't really think it's safe either. And I don't even think it's smart to put a chip in my head. So that means I'll be able to download anything off the cloud. Gee, it's really hard to use my fingers to type on my computer. That's tough work. But so I get a chip in my head. But then ask yourself, this thing's in your head, and you know, that stuff goes both ways, right? So it's like you're getting something there. Can they do something to you? Can you be hacked? All I'm saying here is we're moving into an era, and that's just the beginning, right? That is so bizarrely different. Like, we don't have a reference point for any of this stuff. And in the midst of all that, we're talking about UFOs and disclosure. And I wonder, like, sometimes I think this seems so far down the totem pole of what's important. But it is important. But the question is, so how far will we go in our revolution of our society until we get to a point where this reality is actually obvious and open to us? Will that happen? Or will super advanced AI be managing us in such a way that it too is subject to spin and propaganda and control? You know, one of the big things that sometimes I think some of these idealists fall into the trap of is super strong AI is going to be somehow objective intelligence. But I don't know if that's really the case. We are smarter than a lot of other animals, and we certainly know how to manipulate and spin our reality, and I don't think it's necessarily the case that a super strong AI will be immune from that either. I'm mentioning all this just to point out that in the field of UFOs, UFO research, disclosure, there's so many unknowns that we're right on the cusp of looking at. I don't know how to predict any of this. The last thing I'll just leave you with is my philosophical position on all of this subject, which is that I'm a strong believer in being empirical with our data and with our evidence. And I guess I mean, this is a hard subject, and truth is a very complex phenomenon. But I feel we should never ever fall into the trap of pretending that truth is something subjective, you know, like your truth versus my truth. I think that's a super dangerous perspective to have. And it's a really easy way to kind of lose your cognitive advantages when you start acting like truth is a subjective thing. I don't believe that a single person in this room actually believes that. I think that every one of us knows that there is reality. Otherwise, we would never have debates ever about things that happened in the past, like what really happened with JFK's assassination or 9/11. Like, we all implicitly recognize things happen. There is a truth. And our job, every one of us, our job is to look for that truth. And I feel like if we're not doing that, then let's get out of the room and stop sucking the air out for everyone else who wants to be looking for the truth. So let's look for the truth, and let's do it carefully. Thank you. Thank you. And by that, I simply mean, I'm just wrapping it up here, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't look on the fringe for crazy things, and like, I'm totally in for all of that. But let's be careful and evidence-based, and as scientific as we, in our limited capabilities, can be. And I think that's the best, surest way that we can all move forward in this society and move this conversation ahead. So with that, I just want to thank you very, very much, and hope to see you while you're all here. Those are my websites, and stop by anytime. Thank you.